Okay, and welcome to today's event, everyone. I'm Jason Gumpert from msdynamicsworld.com. Thank you for joining us for another Portals community call hosted by Engineered Code. Our main presenter today is going to be Nick Haydick, a Microsoft MVP, founder of Engineered Code. It's great to have him back once again. He's also joined by two of his colleagues from Engineered Code, Alan and also Paul Fuchs. So welcome to them as well. They will be helping out with Q&A, I believe. We're recording today's event as we have with all of our previous episodes. If you're looking for those, you can find them on our site under the videos section. Just sort of search for Portals or Portals Community Call. You'll find them. You can also find them on YouTube through I believe Nick's channel or the Engineered Code channel. He can tell you more about that as well. We do make time for questions during these events, so look for the questions block and feel free to enter yours as we go. So without any further delay, Nick, I'm going to hand things off to you.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone, or maybe there's some places where it's still good morning. Maybe if you're joining us from Hawaii, then good morning to you, and lucky you. Yeah, thanks, Jason. Today's Portals community call here, the topic we've got is Power Apps Portals ALM. So let's just kind of dive in and go through our kind of regular kind of spiel here. So just quick introduction. As Jason mentioned, my name is Nicholas Haydick. I'm the president and a software engineer at Engineered Code Consulting, Inc., based here in Regina, Saskatchewan, Canada. I'm a Microsoft MVP in business applications, and I've been doing this kind of portal stuff. It's essentially my entire career since the beginning about 10 years ago at ADX Studio. So if you want to reach out, connect with me on LinkedIn or Twitter, or you want to check out my blog or the YouTube channel, the links are there. Again, if you ever want to kind of chat portals, reach out to me on LinkedIn and message me. Always happy to engage in a conversation about portals. Yeah, so that's me. Again, as I do every month, just like to thank the folks, Jason particularly, at MS Dynamics World, who host this call, helped me get the word out about them, and kind of help moderate things a little bit here. So I really appreciate that. They've been great supporters of helping us get this content out to the world. So in terms of our agenda, same as every month, we've got a little bit of Portals news, not too much this month. We'll then get into our topic of the day, which, as I mentioned, is Power Apps Portals ALM. We'll then talk about the date and time of our next Portals community call, and then hopefully there'll be some time for a Q&A if there's any questions that you have, whether it's about Portals ALM or whether it's about anything kind of Portals related. Any sort of portals built on CDS or the Power Platform is kind of what we're here to talk about. All right, moving along here. So let's talk about what news we have for this month. Like I said, pretty quiet month, but there was one fairly major announcement, and that is of a new template that is available for Power Apps Portals. And that is the customer portal for Dynamics 365 supply chain management. So I'll be the first to admit I know basically nothing about what supply chain management is. I know really nothing about the F&O side of Dynamics. What I know about this portal is that it's still based on CDS. It's the same platform that everything else kind of Power Apps Portals is related, but what it's doing is it's leveraging the dual write capabilities between CDS and the kind of the F&O side or the supply chain management. So just going to kind of click on this link here, and we will see. This was the announcement. So as you can see, it's in public preview now. General availability should be hopefully at some point this month. You'll see here that they note that it's not really an end-to-end, like out of the box, turn it on and away you go, but it's really just kind of a starting point, which, I mean, that's pretty typical in the Power Apps portals. None of the solutions are really ready to go off the shelf. They're really just kind of a starter template so that you can then configure and customize and finish it off and make it work for your needs. So again, here it mentions kind of the dual write capabilities between Power Apps portals, which of course are based on the Common Data Service or CDS, and Dynamics 365 supply chain management. So some of the features they mentioned here, you can kind of view order history, view account info, create orders, and it looks like they've got some kind of pre-configured web roles and entity permissions for some of those entities. I haven't tried it. Don't know if I ever will, to be honest with you, because hopefully at some point I get a chance, but like I said, we just don't deal with a lot of F&O customers. But if you are on the F&O side of things, definitely worth taking a look at, because everyone, especially in these kind of strange times, everyone's interested in what we can do with portals. So, all right, back to the presentation, and so that's pretty much kind of all we had for the news this month. There's some good kind of community content. There were some good blog posts. I know that Nick Dolman had some. My blog has been kind of quiet the last couple weeks, but if you're interested in the difference between notes and notes and timeline control on entity forms, I released a new blog post, kind of an intro to a series on those, and so I've got blog posts already queued up for the next 4 weeks on that. So that, along with the portals tips that come out, almost every Tuesday, we have those coming out. So keeping busy with producing some of that new content. So. All right, so let's dive into today's topic, which, as I mentioned, is Power Apps Portals ALM. So what is ALM? I guess it stands for Application Lifecycle Management. It's kind of one of those words that can mean different things to different people, and we're going to be looking at a pretty kind of limited scope of ALM, and of all it could be. What we're really focusing on today is hopefully when you're working on your projects, you have a dev and a test environment, dev test environments, production. And so what we're really going to be talking about is how do we develop with Power App Portals, do things in dev, move it to test, move it to UAT, move it to production. How does that kind of process work? So yes, I know ALM has, there's lots to it, but we're really going to be focusing on how do we go from dev to test to prod, that sort of flow. So let's talk about why this is, this is probably one of the most asked about topics that I when I ask for people to say, hey, what topic do you want me to cover in these portals? This is probably one of the more popular ones that I get asked. And for the record, this is not really something that I've personally done a lot of. And so that's why I've asked Alan from our team to join us, because he's kind of the resident expert at Engineered Code dealing with how the ALM process works. So if you ask any really hard questions, I'm going to delegate those to Alan. But why is this such a hard thing? Like, and specifically with portals, is that with Power Apps Portals, much of the configuration that you do is not within the solution in CDS, but instead it's in the actual record. So it's in the data. So whereas there's a pretty straightforward solution there's a pretty straightforward known way to move solutions between environments. You can export a zip file, you can import it. You can do that programmatically as well. That really only handles kind of the schema for your CDS environment. It doesn't include the data that appears in there. And Power Apps Portals is heavily dependent on the records that are in the database. So when you're doing things and configuring things like entity forms or entity lists, what you're doing is you're creating records. And so how do we move those records between environments in addition to moving the solutions? What else kind of makes it a little bit tougher is that it's a pretty complex data model. So we're not talking about moving one or two settings entities. There are kind of dozens of portals entities. There's entity lists, entity forms, web forms, site settings, web pages, websites, bindings. Like there's a whole lot of entities. And what makes it even more complicated is that a lot of the data is cyclical. So that means, for example, you have web pages with relationships to entity lists, which then have other relationships to web pages. So if you think, hey, I'm just going to export my records to Excel and import them into my target environments. If you export your entity lists, well, the entity lists often point to what is the web page for the create on an entity list. And then you'll also have web pages that point to an entity list that say, what entity list should I display? So now, which one do you import first? Either way, you're gonna be missing some dependencies. Same thing goes with web forms and web form steps. Obviously, your web forms point to a number of web form steps, but your web form steps also can also have a relationship back to their web form. So the web form has a pointer to the first web form step, so there's a lookup there, and then the reverse is true on the web form step. So again, which one do you import first? You kind of have this missing, you have these dependencies, the data is very cyclical, and so just doing, moving data around in Excel spreadsheets, probably not going to be a very fun experience. So what are your options? So these are the ones I'm going to cover today. The first two that we'll look at are tools in the XRM toolbox. So there's one called the Portal Records Mover. There's another one called the Portal Configuration Deployer. I'll then kind of touch on using some third-party kind of more data migration tools or data management, ETLs, that sort of things. Tools like KINGSWAYSOFT or SCRIBE. We'll talk about what Microsoft has as their kind of official answer to this problem, which is the configuration migration utility. We'll talk briefly about package deployer, and we'll also kind of look at, why don't you just write a bunch of custom code to do that? So let's jump in, and we'll talk about the Portals Record Mover. So again, this is a XRM toolbox tool. And not only is it's not just a regular XRM toolbox tool, it's actually created by the author of the XRM toolbox. So if you've never used the XRM toolbox, I would say stop listening to this right now, go and learn about the XRM toolbox, and then watch this recording later. But so Tanguy is the guy who wrote the XRM toolbox, and he's also written this particular tool for the XRM toolbox. So in addition to being good for kind of moving data between environments, the other thing I really like about the Portals Record Mover is that it will export your whole kind of portal configuration to XML, which means you can take backups of it. You can put that into your source control if you want, and if something goes terribly wrong, you've got that thing to refer to. So it also handles the cyclical nature of the data, so it does do the work to try and kind of it knows that web form steps can point to web forms and all that sort of stuff. So it does a good job of trying to handle that. That being said, it's not perfect. It is kind of an all or nothing per entity. So if you say I want to move, I want to move web files, you kind of have to move all web files. Now there are a few kind of filters where you can say based on a certain date. So you can say get me all the ones that were created after a certain date or modified after a certain date, or only get me the active ones. But there isn't kind of this fine grain control where you can say, say define a filter yourself. It's only a few kind of handful of options to decide which entities will get moved over. Although it does handle notes well, and we'll talk about why, kind of why I'm talking about that when we get to the configuration migration utility. But one of the big challenge historically with the configuration migration utility is that it used to grab, it had the same problem. If you said I wanted notes, it would grab all notes. And obviously, when you're talking about portals and web files, the web files are stored as notes. They're stored as the annotation entity in CDS. If you're working on a CDS instance that has a whole bunch of historical data in there, there's going to be notes in there related to things that have nothing to do with portal. There's going to be notes on accounts and contacts and opportunities and cases. Well, you don't want to have to move all of those every time you want to deploy your portal. So the nice thing about the Portals Record Mover is that it did handle that situation. Notes actually wasn't one of the entities you had to move over. It would automatically move over the notes associated only with the web files that you wanted. One of the kind of the drawbacks of it is that you can only use it for kind of the predefined list of portals record types. So often we're finding that when we're building up portals, you're building out maybe some custom entities that are more kind of portals configuration that you'd like to move across. The Portals Record Mover kind of has this defined list of entities that can be moved over. And the tool itself can't be scripted, so it's not a command line utility or anything like that. You have to use the kind of the UI in the XRM toolbox. That being said, because Tanguy has made the XRM Toolbox tool open source, another MVP, Jim Novak, has taken that code and produced a console version of it. So there is that opportunity if you want to script things, you can use the, you can see on there the GitHub, the Portals Records Mover console version of it. So that is an option with on that kind of port of that code. So I'm just going to show you here. I'm going to bring it up and kind of show you how this looks. So I've got the Portal Record Mover open here in the XRM Toolbox. You can see over here, if I were just to click Load Items again, what we've got on the side here is just a list of all of the entities. As I mentioned, kind of one of the limitations is that it's only showing me the entities that were, are defined as the Portals entities. So you can then check, hey, which entities do you want to include in your kind of in your backup or your export. So just as an example, I can say web page, and then you can go in here and you can check the individual pages that you want. But like I said, there's no kind of specific filter criteria that you can apply other than you can say based on date, you can say only active records, you can say only ones related to a specific website. Some of those options exist, but as you'll see when we get into the configuration migration utility, the ability to apply fetch XML on top of it is very useful. So once you've kind of defined which records you want to move, you can just, what you can do is you can export the records. There's a few different options here. Traditionally, these are relatively new. Traditionally, when you'd export it, it would just give you an XML file. But yeah, you can basically export the file, you can save that, you can add it to your source control, all that sort of stuff, and then you can import it, then pick a different, you pick a different environment, point the XRM Toolbox at your other environment, and then you can then do the import where it takes all that data and moves it in. If you're just looking to kind of move from point A to point B right away, you can do that through the transfer here. So you can transfer records without kind of saving it to XML first. So that's another thing that you can do. And then there's some options here so you can kind of save these settings if you want to kind of, if you're doing the same thing over and over again, you can load and save the settings that you've set up here. So. Oh yeah, I've got Oliver mentioning that you can select the individual records manual in the checkbox. So yeah, that's kind of down here. So I would say that this was, for a long time, this was the tool. This was the tool that the vast majority of people I know were using to do this sort of thing. So, on relatively kind of smaller projects, I still see it being used quite a bit. We'll talk about the configuration migration utility, which is becoming more popular that I see. But for, like I said, for a very long time, this was the standard tool that most people we saw were using this, and it still, still does a very good job. Another thing to note is that when you're moving the records across, it maintains the IDs of the record. So if you have a website with a specific GUID as its ID, when it moves across to that other instance, it's matching things up based on ID. And we'll talk about the next tool, which takes kind of a different technique. Most of the tools we see kind of move things based on ID and try and kind of keep the same IDs in the different environments. And that's what this tool does as well. So you can kind of overwrite data in your destination environment as long as the IDs match up. So it's not just always creating net new records. All right. Now jumping back to the presentation here. So we talked about the Portals Record Mover. The next one we'll talk about is the Portal Configuration Deployer. So again, this is an XRM Toolbox tool. I personally, the only time I've ever really kind of played around with it was recently in preparation for this call. So I've never kind of used this in the real world, but it looks like it's it's got a couple good features in there, and it looks like it could probably do the trick on a lot of the smaller implementations as well. In it, you can basically select your source and target environment. So I didn't see anything where you could export and save it to your source control, but it it does let you kind of easily move things back and forth. What's a little bit different about this is that it uses the name field on all the records as its uniqueness criteria. So it doesn't necessarily look at the ID of the records. It's more concerned about what is the name of the records. You are able to kind of move things and target different, you can have a different target website. And then when it kind of runs into conflicts, so if the record already exists in the target environment, it looks like there's some options here where you can choose to either update the target, or you can keep the target as it was, or you can actually have it create a new one, which I guess makes sense. If you're just kind of doing it based on the name, you can have as many records with the same name as you'd like. So that's one of the options that you get there, is that you can say, actually just create another, another one with the same name. So I'm going to jump back to the XRM toolbox here. And I'm just going to go to this one here. So again, this one, whereas kind of the portal's record mover was, import, export, save to a file, import, that sort of thing. This one is, you have your target, you have your source environment, you pick your two environments, and you can kind of move things back and forth. So for example, we've got our list of all the different entities. You can pick kind of what you want to move over, and then you can kind of see what's already in the destination. You select what you want. You click the import button, and it's going to move those records across. Again, if it runs into conflicts, you're going to see pop-ups kind of come up and ask you how to resolve those. Again, this is a pretty slick tool. If you're just, if you've got just kind of one dev environment, you want to move to prod, you want to keep things in sync. It's certainly a lot nicer than kind of copying data over manually. So another good tool. All right. Just going to jump back here to the presentation. All right, so let's talk about KINGSWAYSOFT, or a tool like SCRIBE. So if you do have experience with other kind of data integration, migration, ETL, those types of tools, you can use it, because keep in mind that most of what we're talking about in the portal is just data. It can be accessed directly through the the CDS APIs. So if those are tools that you're comfortable using, you can kind of develop these custom implementations that are using things like KINGSWAYSOFT or SCRIBE. So I would say, again, historically, before the configuration migration utility was updated, which we'll talk about here in a second, for more kind of enterprise level applications that did need to kind of go through a specific ALM pipeline and do all that sort of stuff, I was seeing that KINGSWAYSOFT, SCRIBE, those types of tools were very popular in that space. So something to keep in mind if that's where your kind of skill sets lie. If you're a KINGSWAYSOFT expert, then maybe it's something worth considering. Okay, now let's talk about what I kind of consider to be the what Microsoft considers to be the official answer, and I'll kind of show you. If you look at their documentation, what they've got here is, if you ask the question to Microsoft, how do I move my stuff? They're going to say you use the configuration migration utility. This has become much more realistic since the addition of the fetch XML filtering. Now the fetch XML filtering is pretty recent. It's definitely in the last year. I feel like it's even in the last 6 months that feature has been available. And so again, it goes back to what I was talking about, the notes. Before, if you said, hey, I want to move all my notes across, you had to move, when you did the export, it exported every single one of your notes. And in a CDS implementation that has customer service and sales in it, it wasn't realistic to really want to export that. It was it could be a very slow process. So now with the configuration migration utility, you can say, I want notes, but I only want notes that meet this particular fetch XML criteria. And so in that, you can say, I only want notes associated to web files, for example. So the reason I put kind of quotes, the official there in quotes, is that this was Microsoft's official answer before they had introduced the fetch XML. So the only place where I'd see it kind of being used successfully before they introduced that feature was people were post-processing the XML that was exported before they imported into target environment. So you essentially had to export all the notes, and then you would process the XML that it generated, remove all the ones that you didn't want, and then you kind of continue along. I didn't see that happening. You'd have to have a pretty mature ALM process to kind of want to get into that level of detail. So wasn't something I saw people using a lot because of that kind of that limitation. So the configuration migration utility, that's kind of our, that's what we're doing on kind of our new projects. That's our go-to standard. One of the things that we like to do is to use kind of naming conventions, and that we do that to only target the records that we're actually updating or creating. So for example, when you install, let's say you're installing the partner portal. So you install the partner portal in dev, you then install the partner portal in your test and your production environment. The way that that Microsoft installs those, all that data gets imported, and all that data comes in with the exact same IDs. So the website ID is the same in all those different environments. The web page records all have the same IDs. And then what we start doing is when we start changing those, we add entity lists, we add entity forms, we change things around. Rather than moving all of that data, so rather than moving the website record and all the web pages, the home page, all that sort of stuff, if it's something that we haven't changed, we prefer to kind of leave that out of our ALM process. So in order to make our life a little bit easier, when we create, say, new web templates, what we do is we like to use a specific naming convention so that we can then target that in our fetch XML queries. So let's say you're doing a project for ABC company, you would put ABC at the beginning of all your web template names, and then you can say, hey, I only want to, as part of my ALM process, move the web templates that start with the word ALM, and you can easily do that in your fetch XML query. So that's the process we like to use because we want to kind of keep the package that we're moving across, the data that we're moving across, kind of as slim as possible, and there's no need to kind of overwrite the data that hasn't changed between all the different environments. So that's kind of a trick that we like to use. The nice thing about the configuration migration utility is that it works well in your ALM pipeline. So there are PowerShell commandlets that you can use to kind of script out the configuration migration utility. I'm just going to jump back here. The other thing, and the reason that Microsoft says this is kind of their official thing, is that if you're not familiar with the configuration migration utility, what you do is you define which entities that you want to export. And so what Microsoft has done, and this is why it's their official answer, is that they've given the definition of which entities need to be exported for all of the different portals. So you can see that here. If I click on this, I'm going to go over here, and this is the XML, the definition for the configuration migration utility for the starter portal. And you can see that they've got it for the custom portal, community portal, self-service, partner replace. So all the different portal templates, Microsoft has done the work ahead of time to give you those XML definitions. Now, again, they're a starting point. Rarely would I expect that someone would just use this and never have to touch it, but it's it's not trivial to have to kind of come up with that starter. There's a lot of entities I've mentioned, so it's nice to have this starting point to go with. So that's kind of why Microsoft likes to kind of push this, is that they kind of made their official answer when they said, hey, here, we'll give you the schema files to start from. And then they basically just kind of step you through the process of exporting that data. So you start with your schema file. You can essentially, you give it to that, you export the data, it gives you that data, and then you can then point it at the target. It's similar to how Tangi's portals record mover works, where it's you define which entities. It's just that there's more kind of configuration options within the configuration migration utility where you can apply that fetch XML schema, and it's really kind of meant for scripting as well. So just jumping back here. So as I mentioned, it does work well in ALM pipelines because you can once you've defined your schema, obviously you always need to define your schema, which entities you want to, which types of entities you want to export and what are the filter criteria, but you can then script that to say, here's my schema definition, it will export the records, you can script importing the records, all of that sort of stuff. Whether that's using, again, there's PowerShell commandlets that do it, as well as Whale Hamsey's, he's got a bunch of DevOps tasks that will do it for you as well. So you can kind of use those schema files as inputs to that, and you can just create these Azure DevOps tasks that will export from one environment, move to the other environment, all that sort of stuff. So. All right. If you guys have any questions at all during this, feel free to kind of pop them into the questions area. Happy to answer kind of questions as we go along here. Otherwise, we can wait till the end. So let's talk about package deployer. If that's a tool that you're not familiar with, it's a tool that can be used to move solutions. You can use it to move configuration migration utility data, and you can also have it run custom code once it's kind of done with things. If you ever went through the process of upgrading ADX Studio from version 7 to the open source code release, the open source code release that Microsoft gave on version 8.3, the way that was accomplished was by using package deployer. Because if you remember, we went from a data model where one page had one web page record. We went to the multilingual model where there was kind of a root page and then there was child localized pages. You may have been wondering, if you kind of didn't look into the process too much, how did it create that data? And the way that it did it, when you ran the scripts, it used the package deployer to do that. So it used the package deployer, it installed a bunch of solutions, and then it removed a bunch of the old legacy solutions. And then what it did is it ran custom code to take all of your web page records and duplicate them and create the language specific ones. So it used the package deployer to do it. So if package deployer is in your kind of toolbox, if that's something that you're familiar with, because configuration migration utility data is something that you can do to deploy it, you could use this as well. If there's things you have to do after the fact that require custom code, you can certainly run that as part of the package deployer as well. So again, if it's something that you're familiar with, it's another technique that I've seen used for PowerF Portal's ALM. All right. So as I'd mentioned before, custom code. If you want to reinvent the wheel, or if for whatever reason none of those other tools if the other tools don't meet your needs, you can always write your own code using the CDS APIs. I'm not sure, to be honest with you at this point, if I can think of a good reason why you would always need to do that. At least using the configuration migration utility as a starting point seems to me like it's the best approach. Some people may have code that they've already built from before that was really a viable option, so I guess that could make sense. But again, because it's really just data, or there's some solutions which all can be done programmatically, there's really nothing stopping you from writing your custom code. But again, there's kind of enough tools out there that, as they say, kind of stand on the shoulder of giants. Let them do all the hard work, and then just kind of finish it off by kind of configuring it for your particular needs. So while custom code is an option, to me, if I was starting from scratch right now, I'd be looking at the configuration migration utility and not writing it all from scratch. All right, so I've covered kind of the different options. Now let's talk about some of the challenges that still exist. So I talked about kind of why portals is hard in general. Now the solutions that I presented kind of solve most of those why it's hard. The cyclical data, okay, the configuration migration utility or the XRM toolbox kind of handle that circular data. That's great. The complexities of the data model, all of that's handled by those other tools. But there are still things that make this so that this is just not a problem that's going to just disappear. This is not just something easy. As you see my last point, there's no easy button. So if you're looking for a kind of a true ALM process, a lot of pipelines that we've seen, they'll actually go about creating and spinning up a new CDS environment as part of their deployment procedure. So in order to kind of go through automated testing, they'll spin up a new environment, import all the solutions, set everything up, go through all the testing, and make sure it kind of works from scratch like that. Well, unfortunately, with the portal, there is no APIs to provision a portal. You have to kind of click, 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 use a mouse. You actually have to kind of go through it manually. Same with, there's no APIs to refresh the cache. So even after you've pushed all of your data into your, say, production environment, that, because of the way that caching works, that data won't actually show up unless you refresh the cache. And like I said, right now there are no APIs to restart a portal, refresh the cache, kill the cache, anything like that. So as much as we want to make it automated, there's still going to be those things where if you need those changes to show up right away, there still might need to be a manual process. Another one, it kind of goes back to what I was talking about with the naming conventions. Trying to separate content versus config records can be a bit challenging. Historically, Power Apps portals kind of came from being built as a content management system. So if you can imagine, you have a page on your website where you're sharing the latest news. So you have a news page where you put in your news, or blogs. Say you have blogs. Generally, people are not putting blog posts into dev and then testing them out there, and then put it into test and then testing them out there and putting them into production and seeing them there. Usually, content just kind of goes right into production. The dev and test are usually meant for solution changes or changes to the configuration that affects the functionality of the website, but not necessarily the content. So if you then now have to move data between environments and things are changing in production that don't necessarily get changed in dev, you have content that's getting changed, how do you know what is the most correct version to keep? So obviously, if it's just a blog entity, well, you're probably not including blog entries in your kind of deployment. But if you can think of, say, content snippets, often there will be new content snippets that are created as part of a new functionality in the site. Well, your options are either to not put content snippets in your pipeline, and in which case then you have to kind of create them manually, or do you put them in your pipeline, but what happens if someone legitimately wants to change content snippets in production? Content snippets are kind of designed to be put there so that it's easy to change, say, the labels on some forms, or change content on your website. Do you include content snippets in your ALM process? Do you not include them? We generally try not to include the content snippets. We'd prefer to kind of, if there needs to be a default, we'll put the default kind of in the code, and the content snippets are to kind of override that. But there's this kind of idea of separating, what is considered content, and where you can change it in production without going through the whole deployment cycle, and what's configuration. Another example would be there are certain site settings that do need to be different between environment. Authentication, if you have Azure AD B2C set up, maybe you have a different Azure AD B2C tenant in production versus development versus test. Well, those kind of connection strings, that config is different between environments. Yet there's probably other site settings that you do want to go throughout your development pipe or your deployment pipeline. So just trying to separate which ones should or shouldn't be included, that can be a bit tricky. Again, when we're doing that with the configuration migration utility, the ability to apply the filtering with fetch XML is super helpful, because you can actually define in there, well, these are the entities that I want to include. Anyone that starts with this particular name, or I want this one, and this one, and you can define all of that within your fetch XML. So, but again, it's not just a single button. It's not like a solution where you can click export, get the zip file, import. I guess we could have the managed versus unmanaged. That's a whole other debate. But it is quite a bit more complicated than just moving a solution across. Another place where it can be tricky is handling if records need to be deleted as part of the release process. So most of these tools don't handle, okay, well, I've deleted the record from the source environment, now delete it in the target. That's something that generally these tools aren't handling. So that's either you're writing custom code, or you're having a custom process that does that, because the removal of records is not something that these tools generally handle very well, because it's difficult to include the concept of this record no longer exists, and most of them have not been built that way. So, and so essentially, the long story short is that there's no easy button. A relatively significant investment is required to get any sort of kind of ALM process set up properly, and really have to balance. You have to consider, what is the ROI? Will you get an ROI for smaller projects? So if you're just working on a little tiny portal, what level of automation, what level of all that sort of stuff in your ALM process is worthwhile. I could probably make the argument that at least you should have a dev and a dev and a prod, and use something like the Portals Records Mover, some of those tools for the XRM toolbox to test out all your changes, and then move them over to production. But if you just kind of have one small portal, does it make sense to start getting into Azure DevOps pipelines and configuration, migration, utility, and all that sort of stuff? And if this is your only project, the learning curve can be pretty steep. It's not something that you're going to figure out in the morning and be good to go and never have to think about again. So it's a pretty complex question generally, and there's really there's no easy answer. So just gonna finish up here with some other resources that I'll include in the links or in the notes when I post this to YouTube. A couple of the other Portals MVPs. So the first one is Nick Dolman. What he's built out here is he has a blog post on a simple kind of ALM for Power Apps. Now this is not Portals specifically, it's just Power Apps. But if you're kind of new to Azure DevOps, it's a great kind of starter, showing you all the steps on how to do kind of a simple moving your solutions from dev to test to prod, all that sort of stuff. So if you're new to the whole ALM and you're new to Azure DevOps, it's a very good kind of post for those of us who are kind of new to it. I know when this is not an area where I spend a lot of my day in, so it's a very helpful post for me. Another one, Colin Vermander, who to me is probably the world's leading expert in kind of ALM DevOps stuff, especially when it comes to for Portals. He's got a solution here that kind of has some of the projects that you might want to look at. I know Alan Mervitz, who works with Colin over at KPMG Addoxio. Addoxio has some DevOps tools as well, so I know both Alan and Colin, proper DevOps or ALM are passions of theirs. So there's some great resources on here. So if this is an area that you're looking to kind of learn more about, definitely recommend that you look at that. And then finally, if you want to hear more talking about this, there was a Refresh the Cache episode. This was before I was a host, so you don't have to worry about hearing my side of the story on this one, where both Colin and Nick had interviewed Eugene, who I think he's from, is it New Zealand or Australia, somewhere on the other side of the world, where he had implemented his own ALM procedure. I believe this episode is from last fall, so I think it's before the configuration, migration, utility changes had come in. So he was using a few other different techniques to do that. So definitely worth a listen. I know I re-listened to it in preparation for this because I wanted to make sure I had all my bases covered. So recommend listening to that to hear kind of a few other perspectives on this topic. All right. So our next call will be July 23rd, 2020, which is, if I check my calendar, is that a Thursday? Yeah, it's a Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern time. Again, I would like to express my appreciation for Jason and the folks over at MS Dynamics World for hosting us and helping us out with this. And that's what I was hoping to cover with regards to ALM today. So are there any questions about that, or are there any other Portals questions that anyone has? I'm happy to take those now, or I'm also more than happy to give everyone 15 minutes of their day back. I'm not seeing any questions. Oh, one of our loyal viewers. I think, Cheryl, have you been here every single time, I think?
So I just put a link to the next month's event in the chat for everyone.
No, that's a good idea.
I'm not seeing any other questions either yet.
Okay.
Do you have any contact information you want to put up or anything? They can always follow up with you, I suppose, after the live event ends.
Yeah, I could, if you do have any questions, there's my contact info. All right, well, I don't see any questions, and I think we can just end it here, and everyone can get 14 minutes back and have a great day, evening. I know that's Cheryl, it's the evening for you, so thanks for hanging out and spending your evening with us, or your day, or your morning, and we'll hopefully see you guys all next month on July 23rd.
Great. Thanks to everyone in the audience for attending. And Nick, as always, thank you for presenting.
My
With that, we
pleasure.
will
Anything
conclude.
we can do to get the word out on portals, that's what I like to do.
Great. And with that, we will conclude today's event. Have a good day, everyone.